The first session for today is we're going to talk about what public forum debate is. So public forum debate is the name of the style that we will be using for the rest of this session. And the first session this first workshop, I'm going to kind of talk about what public forum debate is, how public forum debate is different than types of debate you might have done in the past for those of you who are coming from existing debate styles on the island. And even for those of you who are brand new, hopefully this will give you a brief outline and a brief description of what public forum is about and what the beat by beat of a debate round looks like, so you know exactly what to expect. I believe I have shared my screen. We can actually, so can I get a react if you can see me and my screen? Awesome, nice, we're getting the hang of this. Okay. So what is public forum debate? Public forum debate, which we sometimes shorten as PF debate or PFD, is a style of debate in which two teams, one that we call a pro team and one that we call a con team, have a short debate over an assigned question, which we call a resolution. The debate focuses on the broad pros and cons of the assigned topic, which is why we call the team supporting the resolution the pro team and the team opposing the resolution the con team. And the goal of the debate is not to get into the specifics or the details of the policy change or the statement that is being proposed. The debate is much broader and it focuses on the general upsides or downsides of the topic that we are assigned. So for those of you who are coming from the NTNU English debate events, there were two styles. There was a non-policy style and there was a policy style. And the public forum debate is much closer to the non-policy style. So in the policy resolutions, you would debate the details of a government policy, and then the non-policy ones, you kind of debated the broad benefits or downsides of the topic. And that second thing is what public forum debate is like. The main structure of public forum debate, and every single detail that I will talk about for the next hour or so to introduce how the event is structured, is built around these two very important core ideas, which are called the burdens of proof and the burden of disproof or rejoinder. And the reason I'm starting here is because the burdens of proof and rejoinder or disproof are kind of the job of each side. This is what each team has to do throughout the debate in order to meet what is required of them as a team. The burden of proof is very simple. The burden of proof says when you introduce an argument, you have to provide some proof that it is true. So you have to provide some evidence or some reasoning for the claim that you are making. You cannot just assert or say something and provide no backing for it. You have to explain why what you're saying is true. Now, that is pretty straightforward and it connects back to a lot of what you have done before for those of you who have done debate before. What's a little bit different about public forum debate is this idea of the burden of disproof or rejoinder. And the burden of disproof says that once your opponent has introduced an argument and has met their burden of proof for that argument, the opponent, so once the other team has made an argument, you have a burden to respond to that argument. So once an argument has been introduced, a burden is created on the opponent to respond. So it's a little bit different from some other debate events, because in other debate events, sometimes if you present an argument, it's up to the judge whether they buy or whether they believe your argument or not. And of course, that's also true to some degree here. But the difference is, if you fail to provide a response to an argument that was made by your opponent, the judge will treat your opponent's argument as true, no matter what they believe about its strength or its validity. So, burdens of proof and rejoinder. You have to provide a reason your argument is true. And once you have done that, the other team has to provide a response. Otherwise, your argument is conceded and becomes true for the debate. Does anyone have questions about that so far? No questions? People are on board with what I'm saying. Love it. Again, feel free to chime in at any time. And if you are confused about something, if you chime in, I'm sure other people will be very grateful to you, because other people might be shy and might have the same question as you, but might not be willing to ask it in public. Oh, Shanna, I don't think I'm not sure if Shanna mentioned this, but if you want, you can also message us privately. That is a feature. So if you don't want to ask your question in front of everyone, you can also do that. Shanna's nodding, so it sounds like she already said that. Okay. So public forum debate topics are very similar to topics that you all have debated in the past. In US public forum.
Hey, Anthony.
Yeah.
Real quick, before you go back, we did have a question pop up in the chat. Could you, about the burden of proof?
Sorry, yes.
Yeah, it popped up right as you began talking.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out.
Absolutely.
Doesn't the team which presents their argument also shoulder the burden of proof? Yes. So any team that introduces an argument has a burden to prove that that argument is true. So if I introduce an argument and I don't prove it, then I fail my burden of proof, and the other team does not have to respond because I haven't said anything. But if I introduce an argument and I meet my burden of proof, then the other team has a burden to respond to what I've said. Good question. And yes, so in the responses that you make to an opponent's argument, you also, of course, should provide reasoning for your responses. You cannot just say the opposite and not provide an explanation. You have to provide proof for your objections as well. Good point. So public forum debate topics. In the US, the topic changes very quickly. So typically in the US, they will debate one topic for 1 to 2 months at a time. For the purposes of our modified public forum style, though, we are going to be keeping the same topic for each semester. So there will be a fall semester topic and there will be a spring semester topic. And the topics usually focus on something that is current or in the news. And topics can cover a variety of different types of issues. For example, they can focus on policy changes, such as the English test topic that some of you debated just now, or even the policy topic that you debated about gender designations on government ID. Even though that's a policy topic, that could also be something that is included in a public forum topic. It would just be debated with more of an emphasis on the broad idea and less of an emphasis on the policy process. But it can also focus on philosophical ideas. So it can focus on big statements like whether something is ethical or not ethical. Or it can focus on historical claims. So some of my favorite topics focus on questions like, did globalization help or hurt developing countries? Or does trade reduce poverty? Things like that. So these are very broad topics. So lots of different kinds of issues can be discussed in a public forum debate. Our topic that we will be using for this workshop and for the fall semester is this. In Taiwan, social media is beneficial for democratic values. We will go into much more detail about the substance of this in later sessions during this workshop. In particular, I think tomorrow we're doing a whole lecture on the topic and a whole research session about the topic. And at the end of the session, we will be actually having you all do some debates where you will get to practice debating about this topic using some evidence that we will supply for you. But this is the topic for the fall semester. This is the structure of a public forum debate. The basic idea is that teams take turns giving speeches, and each speech, they will use their logic, their evidence, and comparisons to prove their side of the topic. So either social media is beneficial for democratic values in the case of the pro, or it is not beneficial for democratic values in the case of the con. The first speech in a public forum debate is called the constructive. For those of you who have done NTNU English debates, this speech is very similar to the first speech in the non-policy debates. It's 4 minutes long, and the purpose of this speech is for both teams to introduce their case for the first time. So the pro will give a 4-minute speech outlining their arguments for why social media is beneficial for democratic values. And the con will then follow that up with a 4-minute speech of their own, talking about why social media is not beneficial for democratic values in Taiwan. Because this speech is designed as an introduction and does not require you to respond to your opponent yet, since it's the first speech where we're just introducing what we're talking about, the speech is usually pre-written, so you write it out completely in advance. I see a question in the chat about where we can do research. We will do a whole fairly long session tomorrow where we talk about different approaches to research, but the short answer is, you can do research on any platform that you've used for research before, for school or for any project of your own, or for any debate activity or speech activity you've done before. So there's no special rules about where research has to come from. It's just whatever information you can gather to support your point. But again, we will go into much more detail about that tomorrow. Questions about the constructive speech? All right. After the constructive speech, as well as after the second and third speeches in the debate, which we'll get into in a second, there is something called the crossfire. So for those of you who have done debate events before, the crossfire is somewhat similar to the cross-examination period. What makes it similar is that the crossfire is devoted to asking and answering questions between the two sides. So if you walk up to someone random on the street and ask them to picture a debate, they will probably picture something like the crossfire because it's a conversation and both teams share crossfire time to make arguments and to ask each other questions. For those of you who have done cross-examination before, though, crossfire is a little bit different. whereas cross-examination has one team asking questions and one team answering questions for the whole time. Crossfire is a turn-based speech. So one team will ask the other team a question, they will get a response, and then the team that was just answering gets to ask a question of their own. The analogy I like to use for this is it's like tennis or table tennis, where one side sends the other side a volley in the form of a question, they return it, and it's kind of a back and forth where the teams take turns asking and answering questions. The Crossfire is also special because since it's the only speech where interaction between the teams is occurring in real time, this is a speech where you can get clarification on what your opponents are talking about. It's a great speech for getting your opponents on the record about what arguments they've made and what positions they have taken. And if you want to look at evidence and quotes that are being used by your opponents during their speech, Crossfire is a great time to request that from your opponents. So if your opponents have cited something and you want to look more closely at it to see if they are representing it accurately or if the underlying reasoning behind the citation is good, Crossfire is a good time to look into that. Good question in the chat. In Crossfire, who decides the first team to speak? Yes, we will go over Crossfire in much more detail once again tomorrow. Usually it is the pro team that is asking the first question, but Crossfire is kind of special because since both teams are talking, it's really all about what the two teams agree on. A question that I often get about Crossfire is how do people manage to do Crossfire and not have it become just total chaos, right? Because in cross-examination, there's a very clear questioner, there's a clear answerer, whereas in Crossfire, it's a little looser. So how do you keep the Crossfire on track? And the answer is the same as the answer to the questions you've been asking in the chat, which is politeness. Crossfire, more than any other speech in the debate, requires you to be super polite and super reasonable to the other team in order for it to work. You have to let the other team talk. You have to give the other team a chance to answer your questions after you've asked. So it is very, very important to be as accommodating and reasonable as possible during the Crossfire speech. This is a good question, and I was going to cover this later, but I can cover this right now. So something else that is different about US public forum versus the modified public forum that we will be doing here is that in US public forum, there is a role for each debater. So each debater gives a specific set of speeches. In our modified public forum style, we will be relying on teamwork much more because we want to make it a little bit easier for students. So we want to allow students to kind of share their time to make sure that more than one person can help with giving a speech or with asking and answering questions in the Crossfire. So for all of these speeches, any debater on the team can participate. And we encourage the speeches to be a team activity. So actually splitting up the speech and having each debater take a portion of the arguments. And it's the same thing with the Crossfire. We want everyone to be participating. So each person should be asking the other team questions, and both people on the team should be helping to respond to questions from the other side. Really good question. Any other things that you would like to know about Crossfire at this point? if one side loses track on answering questions, for example, by asking something irrelevant, will they be put at a disadvantage? Yes, absolutely. So something that's really, really important about all of the speeches that I'm talking about is I've started both my descriptions so far by mentioning how long the speech is. So like I said, the constructive is 3 minutes or is 4 minutes, the crossfire is 3 minutes, and the speeches actually get shorter as you move through the debate. And what that means is that one of the most important skills in the debate is being effective at managing your time to make sure that you are efficiently and quickly moving through and responding to things your opponent has said. And the reason for this, the reason why this is so important, is the burden of rejoinder I was describing. It's really important to be quick and to be efficient, because if you don't respond to something your opponent says, you risk conceding an issue that will then become true for the rest of the debate, which will put you at a disadvantage. Now, in Crossfire, there is not as strict a requirement. It's just a loose conversation. So if you misunderstand or ask something irrelevant, it's not like you are punished forever. But Crossfire is like every other speech in that there's limited time. It's important to manage your time to be as effective as you can in delivering your arguments. So if any team is doing things that are irrelevant to the debate, of course, that will put them at a disadvantage because they're using their limited time to talk about something that doesn't matter. And time is an important resource.
Hey, Anthony.
Yeah.
Do you happen to know, are you using PowerPoint or Google?
PowerPoint.
Can you turn on the subtitles? Do you know how to do that?
I think I've seen that button somewhere. Let's see.
In the private, I sent you a link that tells you how to do it. Yeah, I think so. Say something. Oh. I think it's picking
yeah,
me up.
we will see if that helps.
Okay, thank you very much, sir.
Wow, those are surprisingly good. I had no idea that this was a feature.
I forgot about it until someone asked for subtitles, and I was like, oh, it's a good idea. Okay, I turn it back over to you.
Sure. Another question was asked, which is, during the crossfire, is it necessary for the questions to relate to what was just said in the constructive, or can you bring up something else? Good question. So Crossfire has lots of purposes. Part of the purpose of Crossfire is poking holes in what your opponent has said. So in order to do that, of course, you would want to ask questions about the speeches that have just happened. In this case, the constructive speeches. But Crossfire also has other purposes. For example, you can use Crossfire to set up an argument that you will be making in a speech that is going to come later. So those questions might not tie into the constructive arguments quite so cleanly, because the purpose of those is to set up something you are going to say in the future. So short answer, questions will often be related to the previous speech, but they do not have to be. Great question. Can the answering side refuse to answer? So like I said, Crossfire requires politeness to work. So if you refuse to answer and just tell the other side, like, I do not want to answer your question, even though I know the answer, that is rude, and you should not do that. The bigger issue is it makes you look like you don't know what you're talking about if you do that, which is also something to be avoided, because part of the point of Crossfire is also to show how smart you are and to prove to the judge that you have a grasp of your arguments and you can pursue them in this free-flowing setting and not just in these speeches that you might have prepared ahead of time. Of course, if you don't know the answer to a question, saying that you don't know is perfectly fine. We will talk about some approaches you can use to avoid having to say you don't know. So what can you do instead of just admitting you don't know? But it's not the end of the world if you don't know the answer to a question. So refusing to answer, not a good idea. If you're unable to answer, that's not ideal, but it's not the end of the world. Can the opponent respond by saying you haven't mentioned that and we will need to think about it and cover it later? So I think that's a good way of answering a question that you don't know the answer to. So something that I'll talk about in a second as we get into these later speeches is that the early speeches are the ones where arguments are introduced. And in later speeches, new arguments are not really supposed to be brought up. You're just supposed to compare and resolve arguments that were introduced earlier in the debate in the first two speeches. What that means for your question is, if in a late Crossfire, you are asked something that is based on an argument no one has talked about yet, it's perfectly fine to say, this would have been a great point to bring up earlier, but now that we're in the late part of the debate, you're not really allowed to make new arguments. So you should bring this up in an earlier speech next time. But for now, I don't think it's important to answer this because this is a new argument that you have not brought up earlier in the debate. But as a general rule for all of your questions, the Crossfire relies on us being as helpful and as accommodating as possible in the spirit of politeness. So always answering a question when you know the answer or can provide one, trying to be as direct as possible. So not trying to avoid or run away from questions is a good idea, because all of those things will make the judge quite frustrated with you. And that is something that we generally want to avoid. If your opponent asks a question that doesn't have a specific answer, how can you react? So I mentioned at the very beginning that the two teams take turns asking and answering each other's questions. So while that is the general rule, because once again, we're trying to be polite and accommodating, it's flexible. So if one side asks a question and the responding team does not provide a direct answer, usually what will happen is that the questioning team will ask permission to ask a follow-up question. And because we're being polite, the responding team will say, sure, we're happy to answer a follow-up. And then the questioning team will ask a second question to try to get the other team to answer more specifically than before. There are a variety of things we can do to phrase our questions in a way that forces a specific answer, and we will talk a lot about that tomorrow when we go into Crossfire in more detail. Is it possible that research is incorrect? Sure, of course. Since there are two sides to the argument, of course, usually one side's research, I mean, by definition, since we're disagreeing with each other, whenever we have an issue where only one side can be right, one side will be wrong. And usually both sides will have research. So what that means is there will be something that is wrong with the research of the side that is wrong. Crossfire is a great time to start bringing that up. but that is also something that can be talked about in speeches to a great degree. Good questions. I love how engaged everyone is. This is exactly what we love to see. Okay. So far, we've talked about the constructive, where we introduce arguments, and the crossfire, which is the question and answer period. The second speech in the debate is called the rebuttal speech. The rebuttal speech, like the constructive, is 4 minutes long. And the purpose of the rebuttal is to introduce your side's responses to your opponent's case. So these first two speeches are very simple. The constructive, you introduce your case, and then in the rebuttal, you attack your opponent's case. Because the second rebuttal obviously follows the first rebuttal and knows what arguments the first rebuttal made, the second rebuttal can start to respond to what the first rebuttal says, but does not have to. So all the rebuttal speaker has to do is attack their opponent's constructive speech. But if they have extra time, the second rebuttal speaker can start responding to the arguments in the first rebuttal as well. So constructive and rebuttal, very straightforward. You introduce your argument, and then you attack your opponent's argument. The rebuttal is followed by another 3-minute crossfire. It works exactly the same way as the first one, so I will not rehash that again. Oh, questions about the rebuttal before I talk about this? Oh, is the rebuttal pre-written? So I mentioned the constructive is a pre-written speech. The rebuttal, you will have to obviously respond to what your opponent is talking about. And you don't know exactly what your opponent will say ahead of time. You can only guess what arguments your opponent will make. So it will usually not be possible to write your rebuttal completely before the debate starts, because you're not going to know exactly what your opponent will say. But you can guess what your opponent will say because we have a broad idea of what arguments are available on each side of the topic. So teams should prepare different arguments or rebuttals to different arguments that they can assemble into a rebuttal speech, but it won't be completely pre-written, unlike the constructive. Can you ask questions regarding the opponent's constructive during the crossfire following the rebuttal? Yes, there are not restrictions on what you can ask your opponent in a crossfire. You are allowed to ask whatever you want. I would recommend asking questions about the last speech because you already got 3 minutes to talk about the constructive, the crossfire before. So it's usually a better idea to focus your second crossfire on your opponent's rebuttal. But if you feel like it would be more useful to ask questions about their constructive some more, that is also acceptable and completely okay. Good question. So after the constructive and the rebuttal, we now move into the second part of the debate. The third speech in the debate is called the summary. And the reason I'm saying this is the second part of the debate is because this is where the debate gets a little bit complicated. So the constructive, you just introduce your stuff. The rebuttal, you just attack your opponent's stuff. In the summary, you have to do both. You have to defend what you said in your constructive against your opponent's attacks, and you have to press forward with your own attacks against your opponent. Not only do you have to do both things that you had separate speeches to do before, but you have to do it in less time. As you can see, unlike the first two speeches, which are 4 minutes each, the summary is just 3 minutes long, which basically means that you have to cover 8 minutes worth of arguments in 3 minutes worth of time. Now, that sounds really hard, probably. But what makes it easier is that you don't actually need to cover all 8 minutes, because an important summary speech skill is strategy and making choices. Even the best debaters, the most efficient debaters, are almost never going to be able to actually respond to literally everything that their opponent said and defend literally everything that they said. So an important part of this speech is picking your battles, figuring out which issues are okay to concede and which issues are really important, so that you have to defend them or win that they are true in order to win the debate. Strategy and choice making are not the easiest things in themselves, but we will hopefully make that element of this a little more clear as we go into what it takes to win an argument and how we decide what the most important parts of the debate are over the next few sessions. And there is a crossfire after this as well. Questions about the summary speech? Yes, as before. So earlier I said the crossfire that's about the rebuttal can ask questions about the constructive. Same thing here. The crossfire that's after the summary, you can ask questions about anything that happened earlier, but for the same reason as before, it's a good idea to focus on the summary speech, because that's kind of the first time you get a chance to challenge what they're saying in the summary speech. Got a question about new arguments. So like I said, the first half of the debate is where you want to introduce your big contentions, right? So you have your big argument for your side, you have your big responses to what your opponent is saying. You are not allowed to bring up entirely new types of arguments in the summary. So if your first reason for why social media helps democracy was completely focused on how it helps young people organize and be activists, you cannot just pivot in the summary to a brand new argument until about something completely different. You have to stick to your broad idea, but you can make new arguments against your opponent's new responses to what you said. So in response to a new rebuttal argument, you can absolutely make new comparisons, indict their evidence, anything like that. Yes, during rebuttal, teams do not have to try to defend their cases. You will wait until the summary to start defending your case. With the exception, like I said, the second rebuttal, if you have extra time, you are allowed to start defending your case if you would like, but you do not have to do that. You can wait until the summary to do it. Nice. The last speech in the debate is called the final focus. The final focus speech is the easiest to understand, I think. It's kind of the wrap-up speech. It is where you make your closing pitch to the judge about why you should win the debate. Everything I said about the summary speech is also true of the final focus, but to an even greater degree, because the summary gave you 3 minutes, but the final focus gives you just 2. So everything I said earlier about making choices, focusing only on the arguments that are the most important to winning your position, all of that is true of the summary, and it's even more true in the final focus. Just like the name suggests, you want to narrow down the debate to only those issues that you believe are the winners for your side. Something else that starts in the summary but really becomes important in the final focus is comparison. And we'll go into the different kinds of comparisons you can make later on. But comparisons are really important in these later speeches because, like I said, you can't make completely new arguments, right? You can make comparisons to try to resolve the arguments that have already been introduced in the rebuttal and constructive. So comparisons about quality of evidence, comparisons about the quality of reasoning, comparisons about the significance of one side's argument versus another side's. These are the backbone of these later speeches. These comparisons are usually what makes the difference between a winning set of speeches and a losing set of speeches. Questions about the final focus? I got a question, which is, so the question is how can you win the debate even if you fail your burden of disproof? So that's a good question. So what I think this person is asking is, if you're making these choices and you're not addressing every issue, how is it that you can win the debate if I started this all out by saying you have to respond to everything your opponent said? The answer is that not every issue is equally important. So for example, in my constructive speech, I might start out with 2 reasons social media is beneficial for democracy in Taiwan. I don't need both of these reasons to win. The reason I bring up 2 instead of 1 is to give myself options for later speeches so that in the summary and in the final focus, I can look at the arguments that have been made, decide which of my reasons has a better chance of helping me win the debate, and just focusing on that reason. Let's say I said social media helps activists organize and it helps get people to vote. Those are 2 different reasons why social media could be good for democracy. Let's say the con has a really, really killer study about why social media actually does not get people to vote more. And I call for their study. I ask to see their study in the Crossfire. I read through it. It's really good. I don't know how to answer it. I'm going to say, all right, fine. I'm going to concede social media does not make people more likely to vote. I'm not going to focus on that issue. Instead, I will say social media is still beneficial for democracy because of the other argument I made about activism and organizing. It's the same for your attacks on your opponent. in your rebuttal speech, you might start out with 4 or 5 attacks against each of your opponent's contentions. But by the end of the debate, you will not have time to go for all of your different attacks. You will have to pick your best ones and focus just on those. By the way, we will start day 3 of our workshop by showing you all a demonstration debate between Shanna and myself. And you will be able to see a lot of what I'm talking about playing out in real time. So that will hopefully be useful in figuring out exactly how this works in an actual debate. One other thing I want to mention is prep time. So for those of you who have come from NTNU English debates, you are familiar with this broad idea, which is that during certain portions of the debate, I think we have not completely finalized when exactly this will happen in our modified style of public forum, but I believe it is before each set of speeches. So before the rebuttal, before the summary, and before the final focus. There will be a prep period where teams get to consult with their partners and teammates and discuss strategy and jot down some notes about what arguments they want to make in the speech that is coming up. This is very simple because you're kind of told when it happens. There will be a moderator in the debate. You will be told the following 2 minutes or however long are your prep time, and you get to spend all of that 2 minutes preparing your speeches. In US public forum, it works a little bit differently. The difference is that there is not a pre-assigned time when teams are supposed to use prep time. Instead, each team gets a pool, so a total amount of prep time that they can use at any point in the debate between speeches. So instead of saying you get 2 minutes of prep time before each speech, this version says you get 4 minutes of prep time total. You can use it whenever you want. You can use it all for the rebuttal, or you can save it all for the final focus, or you can split it evenly, however you want. That is not what we're doing in our modified style, but the reason I'm mentioning it is for those of you who want to participate in the US Public Forum national qualifier. There is actually a qualifying tournament in Taiwan where you can compete using the US rules to debate in the US National Public Forum tournament. Good question. Pool just means you get a lump of prep time that you can split up however you want. So it's not different chunks that you are told when to use. It's you get a total amount of prep time, and the team gets to decide when to spend it. So the total is set by the tournament. So the tournament will say each team gets a total of, let's say, 4 minutes of prep time. And then during the debate, if a team wants to use some prep time, they will raise their hands and say, "Judge, I would like to use some prep time." And then their clock would start. They can prep for however long they want, until, of course, up to a maximum of how much total time they have. And they can use as much or as little of that time as they want. So maybe I want to use 30 seconds to prepare for my rebuttal, and I want to use 2 minutes to prepare for my summary, and I want to use 1:30 to prepare for my final focus. I can split it up however I want, is the idea of this. Shanna makes a very good point, which is that in both of these models, regardless of whether the prep time is pre-assigned or flexible, when one team is prepping, the other team can prep too. So if we're working in pre-assigned times, this is very simple. There's just a time where it's 2 minutes before the rebuttal speech. both teams get to use that as preparation time. With flexible time, if the pro team stands up and says, we want to use some of our preparation time before the rebuttal speech, the con can also prep while the pro is prepping. And the opposite is also true. The pro can always prep while the con is prepping. But again, this flexible one is a little bit more complicated. I'm only bringing it up for those of you who might want to debate at the US national qualifier to compete at the US national tournament, which I would strongly encourage everyone to do. The US national tournament is awesome. Hopefully by then we will get to travel. It's a lot of fun. One of the highlights of one of the funnest times from when I was in high school was the times when I got to compete at that tournament. So I really encourage everyone to do this. But you don't have to. And for those of you who just debate using our modified style, we will be using pre-assigned times, which are going to be much simpler. Something else that is different between modified public forum and those of you who have done NTNU English debates is this idea of framework. You've probably been doing things that are similar to framework if you've done any kind of debate, but in public forum, we put a label on it. We have the special term. And framework is basically how the judge decides the debate. It is a good analogy is the judge has to measure how good the pro side is and how good the con side is and compare them to each other. And framework is the measuring stick you use. Oh, got another question about the prep time, which is when should teams tell judges they want to use their prep time during flexible times? Good question. You can use flexible prep time at any point in the debate when someone is not talking. So you cannot do it during a speech. You cannot do it during a crossfire, but between crossfires and speeches, as long as you have prep time to spend, you can spend it. Good question. And teams don't need to wait to be called on to do this or anything. You literally just stand up and say, Judge, I want to use some prep time. And then the clock starts running until you tell the judge that you're done prepping, and then the clock stops. Good question. So framework. Like I said, the analogy is it's the measuring stick you use to compare the benefits of the pro side and the benefits of the con side. And frameworks can be broad, so they could be as general as a whole ethical theory. So you could say something like, the judge should vote for whichever team's arguments save the most lives or create the most happiness or are the most moral or fulfill an ethical duty. Right? These are very broad ideas. So an example of where that might come up is if you say social media helps many people get access to a democratic process on one side, but then the con says that social media gives people that access in an unfair way. There might be a framework debate that is very broad about whether helping lots of people is good or if being fair is more important, even if you help less people. That's an example of a broad framework debate. On this topic about social media in Taiwan helping democratic values, the frameworks will likely be much more narrow. So a framework debate could focus on whether informed voting or civil rights are the more important democratic value, right? So the resolution or the topic says social media is beneficial for democratic values. But if it harms one democratic value while benefiting another, the way the judge will decide which issue is more important is partly through the framework debate. Questions about framework? Okay. So to recap, for those of you who are coming from NTNU English debate and have experience with non-policy debate, there are 4 main differences. You have 1 team representing each side instead of 2. So there's 1 pro team and 1 con team. Instead of there being 2 speeches per side, or per team, there are 4 speeches per team, with crossfires in between each. Crossfire is different than cross-examination because you take turns and there is a shared time for asking and answering questions. And we have these burdens of proof, which is something that is familiar to you and something that you all know about. And this burden of disproof or rejoinder, which is something that's a little newer and that public forum focuses on much more than non-policy debate. Questions about anything that I have talked about?
Yeah, so there we go. I got a really good question that you might want to talk about. So does framework help you construct your arguments from the very beginning?
That's a really, really good question. So framework can absolutely help you construct your arguments from the beginning. So when you put together your argument, let's say you're defending the pro side, you want to say social media is beneficial for democratic values. No matter whether you do this on purpose or on accident, whatever argument you write about why social media is beneficial for democratic values, you will have a framework, whether you know it or not. There is a reason why what you are talking about is important. There's a reason why it's more important than the other team, right? That reason could be that it's important to make people happier. That reason could be that the most important democratic value is voting, right? You might not say this explicitly or clearly, but that idea is going to be present in your speech. So thinking about framework specifically will be helpful for that, because it means that you're making a choice and not just doing something by default about which values and which implications to what you're saying are the most important and will help you win the debate the best way. I want to mention also, sometimes the teams will agree about the framework. Sometimes teams will both accept, like, voting is the most important democratic value, or fairness is more important than helping lots of people. And in that situation, there would be a narrower debate where the teams disagree about which side solves that framework better. So which side is more fair, which side helps more people, or which side helps voting the best, right? So yeah, while the two sides often disagree about framework, that does not always happen. On a related note, so I do see the other questions and I will loop back, but I'm just going to answer the framework question first because that's what I'm talking about right now. Do debate judges decide framework throughout the debate? I'm not entirely sure exactly what you mean by this, but I think what you're asking is, like, do debate judges wait until the end to make their decision, like their final decision about which framework is the best? And for both framework and for any other issue in the debate, of course, the judge will be thinking about which side is ahead or behind on a particular issue throughout the debate. But the final decision on these issues will wait until the end. We'll wait until all the debaters have made their arguments. Yeah, good question about Crossfire. What happens if the opposing team is taking up too much time and your team doesn't get enough time to ask your own questions? Again, this is about politeness. So if your opposing team is hogging all of the Crossfire time and being annoying, the judge will know. So that's the first thing that is important to remember. If the opposing team is doing something to make Crossfire not work, it will be very obvious that that is happening, and the judges will be irritated with them, and that will make your team more likely to win. So the most important thing is you might be tempted as a debater, and I certainly was very often, when the other team just keeps talking and talking, you might be tempted to get cross with them, start jumping in and like cutting them off all the time, not letting them say anything just so you can get all of your points out. And I would caution you not to do that, because the team that navigates the Crossfire with the most poise and grace and politeness is going to be the team that comes out ahead in the eyes of the judge most of the time. However, Shanna's totally right that there are polite ways that we can make sure that we're getting ourselves heard as well. Saying, excuse me, can I ask another question because of limited time? Or saying, I think that you've said what I wanted to hear, so you can ask your own question now. All of those are perfectly reasonable things to say. It's just important to be polite when we say them, to make sure that we are coming off as the nice people in the Crossfire so that the judge likes us and hopefully does not like our opponents as much. Any other questions about anything that I have talked about? About the constructive speech, this is an excellent question. Do we need to define the terms in the topic, like social media and democratic value? There is not a rule that says you need to have a definition of social media or democratic value in your speech. It can be helpful, depending on your argument, to define what these terms mean. And tomorrow, when we go into more detail about the topic, we will discuss some different definitions of social media and democratic values. Where this mainly matters is exactly what you're asking with your second question, which is, what if the two sides don't agree? Like, what if I stand up and say, social media is beneficial for democratic values in Taiwan because YouTube is really good? And then the con stands up and says, that's not social media. What are you talking about? Right? YouTube's not social media. It's just some website with videos. Then we will have a debate. I will present my argument for why social media includes YouTube. The con will present an argument for why social media does not include YouTube. We might cite some sources for this. I might cite a lawyer, the con might cite a dictionary, and there will be a back and forth about which which definition is preferable, which definition is more accurate, more predictable, more precise. So yeah, it becomes like any other issue. a matter of disagreement between the two sides throughout the different speeches. If you are judging, should you take points out of the team that takes up the opposing team's questioning time, or expect the polite team to make a proactive move? So we will talk about judging in more detail on day 3. After we show you the demonstration debate, we will actually ask everyone to judge the demonstration debate, to walk you through the steps of what judges should worry about. Part of what's different about public forum debate is that, so you asked about points. While judges will have a rubric, so like a sheet of paper with some suggestions about what to look for in a good speech or a good crossfire, the winner is not determined by points. The winner of the debate is decided by who better explains and who better argues for their side. So as a judge, the reason politeness matters is because when you're impolite and rude, that makes you as a debater less able to persuade the judge that you're right, because the judge is annoyed at you. So it's not really about taking away or giving points. As a judge, your job is just to decide who debated better and who better explained the arguments for their side and who better proved their side of the argument. And how exactly to decide this is kind of up to you, because as a judge, you are the final decision maker. You get to make the call on what is persuasive to you, what you care about, what issues matter to you and what issues don't matter to you, right? So it's not really about the points, but it's about how being impolite broadly affects how the judge sees you, whether they see you as nice and reasonable and credible and trustworthy, or whether they see you as a bit of a troll.